Now that Final Fantasy VII Remake is out and in the public's hands, all we have left to do is wait. Wait for the second part of what could be a 3 or even 4-part saga. And it's not going to be easy. It could take anywhere from 2 to 4 years for the second episode to release. However, with that wait comes ample time for speculation about what the next entry is going to offer us. What else about this fascinating world is going to be expanded on from the original game? Is anything going to be cut? And more importantly, where will Part 2 end? I'm going to discuss all of those things and more here, and just so you know, there will be spoilers for Part 1. I don't know why you would click this video if you cared about that, because we're discussing the sequel, so obviously it stands to reason that spoilers for the first game would be in here, but better safe than sorry. Also, I'm going to be pretty detailed in this video, so it may end up being a little lengthy. Feel free to listen to it podcast style if you feel so inclined. If you watched my spoiler discussion video, you know about the Final Fantasy VII Remake Ultimania, the 700-page encyclopedia dedicated to explaining and detailing the game's world, characters, story, and development. But in case you didn't, there's actually a very in-depth interview inside it with director Tetsuya Nomura, producer Yoshinori Kitase, and scenario writer Kazushige Nojima. For your convenience, I'll leave a link to the full translated interview in the description. For this video though, I'll only be touching on one specific part. When asked about the content of the next game, all they did was more or less ensure that the story will remain the same with only occasional deviations. To quote Kitase, "I've talked about this extensively with Nomura, but I'm sure fans of the original are expecting to revisit familiar locations and scenes, so we have strong feelings to not stray away from that. From here on out, we're not drastically changing the story and making it into something completely different than the original. Even though it's a remake, please assume that FF7 will still be FF7 as usual." Following that statement was Nojima. "For me, I create scenarios that follow the general flow of the original story, but with the assumption that the way things are presented or how events occur might be slightly different." So what does this mean? Kitase seems to intend to stay as true as possible to the original game, while Nojima seems much more willing to make changes, albeit probably small ones. Generally, I think it's safe to assume that we won't see gigantic alterations from the structure of the original game, at least not right off the bat. With the way things are and how the first episode ends, it seems reasonable to expect the story to continue to play out the same way as we know it, at least the major beats of it. But what does that entail? Won't other chunks of the narrative receive the same treatment of expansion as Midgar did? Well, that question is essentially the basis of our speculation about the content of Remake Part 2. I'm not going to cover the events of the entire original game, only what I think could be reasonably included in the next episode of the Remake saga. Of course, there are also some things I can't speculate on, such as the supposed alternate timeline where Zack is suggested to have survived at the end of Part 1. Reason being, I obviously have no fucking idea where they're going with it, because it's not in the original game. Your guess about that plot point is as good as mine. It could be a red herring that hardly appears in Part 2 at all, or it could be half the game. I have no clue. However, if this supposed alternate timeline is playable in any way, its length could push Part 2's ending point closer to the front end of the story, which could be disappointing in a way because it would mean that the remake saga may end up being 4 parts or more, and the idea of this story taking over a decade to be completed is not one that inspires confidence. Regardless, that doesn't change the purpose of this video. So, let's get down to business. First thing I want to discuss is gameplay. I don't expect any major changes to the combat, as the development team seem to have created a gameplay loop that the vast majority of people seem very content with. What I do expect is more variety, particularly in materia, abilities, and enemy skills. For materia, it goes without saying that we need more summons, as Part 1 summons only make up less than half of the total of what the original game offers, not including the summons you get from buying the game, like Carbuncle, Chocobo Chick, or Cactuar. In Part 2, I can see Ramuh, Titan, Odin, and Kujata being added to the roster. In regard to magic, command, complete, and support materia, it's a bit harder to make predictions because there was a bit of mixing and renaming in the first game, but I think it's safe to assume that we'll see new ones in each category, though perhaps not many. For abilities, I can see the starting cast getting a couple more throughout Part 2, but assuming they start with the abilities they could have gotten in Part 1, I think the majority of new abilities will go to Red 13 and the forthcoming new members of the party, Yuffie, Cait Sith, Vincent, and Cid, also assuming we see all 4 of them. Enemy skills is the most obvious in receiving an expansion because we could only get 4 in Part 1, which is shockingly low despite how many unique enemies were in that game. In regard to quality of life improvements, I'd really like to see savable materia loadouts, perhaps up to 3 per character, and maybe even an entire party-wide loadout option. It can get pretty tiresome to manually switch materia between characters one at a time, even with the nice new materia menu that shows everyone's sets at once. I'd also like to see some AI control, allowing the player to set how their teammates act during fights and set priority levels for things like offense, defense, and healing. I know leaving this out in Part 1 may have been a purposeful decision to ensure that you don't accidentally set them to behavior that does more harm than good, but the way that your AI party members functioned occasionally didn't feel all too reliable. They were sometimes a little too passive and barely gained any ATB on their own, or too aggressive and just got themselves killed. I know that a good materia loadout is meant to cover up their shortcomings, but a bit more precision in how they behave would be nice, so it cuts down on how often you feel like you're just babysitting them. A question I personally have regarding gameplay in Part 2 is, how are we going to start stat-wise? I know it's not terribly important in the long run, but I'm very curious as to how, or if, everyone will be scaled back down to level 7. Or will we start at level 30, but with overhauled stat growth and a higher level cap? Perhaps the game will say we're at level 30, but that's just for show and our actual stats resemble that of level 7. Also, how many materia will we begin with? None? Several of each category? How many weapon abilities do we keep? All of them? Or will we need to relearn them? It's really difficult to pin down what the party's levels, stats, abilities, and materia will be once the game starts, because there are a lot of places they can go here. It's admittedly almost not even worth trying to predict. A popular theory is that we stay at level 30 or so, but Yuffie is the one who steals everyone's materia, sort of making her an equalizer that makes the first quarter or so of the game tough again. And I can see that happening. Personally, I think it's a safe bet to just scale everyone back down to level 7, but let them keep all their weapon abilities, summons, and give them a starting bundle of materia that includes several of each type starting at level 1. It's unimaginative, yes, but also the most uncomplicated approach. But they could surprise us and get clever in a way that we don't expect. Moving on to my second major subject, let's talk about the world. The first thing we see after leaving Midgar in the original game is something we don't even know will exist in Remake Part 2, and that is the Overworld. Every Final Fantasy up to 9 had an Overworld, a compact version of the entire globe where you walked through forests, over mountains, and across wide open plains, and an upscaled version of your main character was seen on screen. It looks a bit cartoonish in hindsight, but it worked at the time. In Final Fantasy X and beyond, it stopped showing up, because it turned pace-breaking and ultimately just not necessary to add. Since this story is cut into episodes, an overworld might be pointless. If we got one, we'd probably end up seeing things like villages and cities that aren't even accessible because they're not even in the game yet, and all that would do is draw disappointment. Its only benefit would just be nostalgia for nostalgia's sake. I think the fate of Remake's Overworld has 2 paths. The first is a more restrictive version where you're forced towards progress and can't really move around much. You'll be on that compact globe, but the map will be slightly redesigned to push you more towards where you need to be. The second, and more likely outcome in my opinion, is no real overworld at all, and just a segmented open world that's closer to 10. We won't see a compact version of the entire globe, we'll just see a portion of the surrounding environment at a normal scale. But who knows, maybe they'll think of something unique. I'm open to it, but personally I wouldn't hold my breath on the overworld coming back. It may be an aspect of Final Fantasy that's just destined to stay in the past. My next talking point is towns. I think it's a reasonable expectation that every major location we come across throughout the story is going to be expanded on in two key ways: physical size and content. Physical size is self-explanatory. I believe towns are going to be larger and more openly explorable. For content, I'm referring to both story-related cutscenes and interactions, and things like side quests. Obviously, the volume of new content we receive depends on the location's relevance to the story, but generally speaking, I think every location will get some, including Calm, Junon, Costa del Sol, Gold Saucer, Cosmo Canyon, and Rocket Town. I left out Corel because it's supposed to be destroyed with only a few people around living in tents, so if it does receive some expansion, I don't think it'll be significant. Junon and Gold Saucer in particular are interesting cases because they have potential to go in somewhat different directions. Junon is the biggest city in the game not named Midgar. It's divided into two sections. The first section is the town down on the surface, and the second is the larger city at the top. And this area is where things might get complicated. This city part of Junon might not be expanded much because in the original game, you spend the entirety of it away from the party and there's no battles here. Cloud steals a Shinra infantryman uniform and participates in a parade and celebration of Rufus Shinra taking over as president of Shinra Electric Power Company, with the intent of sneaking onto a ship. However, we might be surprised by a major restructuring of this section that allows us to explore more freely, possibly with the whole party. I think the marching and saluting minigames will make a return, and they'll probably be similar in concept to the squatting and pull-up games in Part 1. As for Gold Saucer, if you remember correctly, you'll know that the famous date sequence does not happen during the initial visit. That could change in Remake Part 2, depending on how much happens before this point. Even if it doesn't change, I still anticipate this place being more freely explorable this time around, but content-wise, there isn't a lot to do during the first visit in the original, as Battle Square and Event Square are not accessible, but you can play some minigames in Wonder Square to painstakingly grind for GP. However, if the second Gold Saucer visit doesn't happen in Part 2, the two closed squares could be open, because where else are we going to get our obligatory Coliseum fights? I can also definitely see some more minigame options being added as well, perhaps even some sort of return of the minigames we saw in Part 1, like the workouts, darts, and possibly even dancing. My next short point is going to be about dungeons. Simply put, I expect all major dungeons to receive expansions similar to what the towns receive in physical size, with most receiving new or additional bosses too. For example, the Mithril Mines. It's the first dungeon you walk through after leaving Midgar, and it's not a large area at all. It's only a few screens, and if the RNG is on your side, you can probably waltz through it without even getting into a single battle. I definitely expect it to be larger and given a new boss to punctuate the end. The same prediction applies to essentially every dungeon afterward. My next subject is optional characters. There are only two missable party members in the original game, Yuffie and Vincent. To be frank, I don't expect them to be optional anymore. Creating fully voiced and realized main characters in a modern-day Final Fantasy just to make them missable probably seems like an awful prospect to the dev team, especially considering every piece of sequel compilation content featuring or mentioning them. So I'd put my money on them being mandatory now. I imagine Yuffie will either ambush the characters soon after they exit the Mithril Mines, or perhaps the party will be forced to take a detour through a nearby forest, and we'll fight her there. There's a chance we may not fight her at all and the battle will be a cutscene, but I think it would be cool if they kept the encounter. In Vincent's case, I think the team will be driven to explore the mansion in Nibelheim when they visit, possibly expecting information on Sephiroth there, only to discover Vincent in his coffin. The next thing to discuss is minigames, and this is where things might get sacrificed. They probably won't, because if they bother to bring back squatting, then anything might come back, really. First is the Chocobo farm. I don't doubt that the farm itself will be physically present, but the existence of the Chocobo breeding side game could be up in the air, though it does give some amazing rewards in the original game, including the coveted Knights of the Round summon, and I can't imagine it being too difficult to implement. Its inclusion will probably be guaranteed if Chocobo Racing is kept as well. Then there's the notorious Fort Condor minigame, which is a series of real-time strategy fights where you defend the fort from enemies that attempt to climb to the top. It's appallingly slow, but potential rewards are pretty good, including a Phoenix summon. You unlock more battles as you complete more of the story, totaling at 21, with only one of those being mandatory. The one thing making this minigame's return questionable is how much work it will probably require to make it fun and investing according to modern standards. If it's still as sluggish as before, I don't think many people would be pleased. After that is the aforementioned Chocobo Racing in the Gold Saucer, which I'm confident will return. I see races functioning similarly to how it does in Final Fantasy XIV, which in itself feels like an evolution of how it worked in the original FF7. And last is snowboarding, which is so far into the game that the location might not even make it into Remake Part 2 at all, and might be pushed back into Part 3. Either way, I do believe snowboarding will return, because I don't think it'll be any harder to implement than Chocobo Racing, especially if there's only one track. Now we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of this video. Finally, with all that other stuff out of the way, I want to talk about potential ending points that finish Part 2 and lead into Part 3. Obviously, this is a little tricky because with enough expanded content, damn near any point in the story is a potential ending point. But I have 5 key spots in mind that I think Nomura and crew are most likely to consider. My criteria is nothing more than places that I think might make sense in respect to the pacing and spots where climactic rising action may be possible, whether it was shown in the original game or through some potential story alterations that I could reasonably see happening. I'll go over them in chronological order, from earlier in the game to later. Some will sound a bit more outlandish and improbable than others, I'll admit, but I'm just keeping options open. First is Mount Nebel and Rocket Town as a combined set piece. Let me elaborate. Mount Nebel could be expanded greatly in the same way the Shinra building was, and we could see a climactic escape from Shinra forces after acquiring the Tiny Bronco, similar to the freeway sequence. And if another new Jenova fight were to be snuck into the game, Mount Nebel could be a good place to do it. Plus, we'll have gotten all party members before this point, though Sid will probably not be playable similar to Red 13 at the end of Part 1. Basically, I chose this point because it has potential to mimic the end sequences of the last game. My second selected ending point is Wutai, which could actually end this episode of the saga in a way that's totally different. In the original Final Fantasy VII, it's possible to go to Wutai as soon as you acquire the Tiny Bronco, but its relevance is limited to a side quest. However, it could be very easy to turn it into something mandatory, seeing as how Yuffie will likely no longer be missable. In Remake Part 1, the war with Wutai is mentioned no small amount of times. In fact, it's occasionally front and center in some conversations, and a semi-frequent talking point among the cast is how Shinra may use any excuse they can grab to continue that war. With some modest changes to the story, it's totally possible to end Part 2 with a sequence where a small Shinra army invades Wutai and sparks a battle that the main characters are forced to participate in. The third possible endpoint is the Temple of the Ancients. It's already a fairly complex place, but I can imagine it being turned into a 2+ hour long dungeon similar to Hojo's Labs in Part 1. The temple also gives us 2 boss fights in relatively quick succession, with potential for a third and perhaps a fourth from a new Jenova enemy and Sephiroth, who does show up here to manipulate Cloud into giving up the black materia. This is also a noteworthy potential endpoint because it's after the Gold Saucer date, which would act as the one event of the game that collects your affinity points with other team members for different unlockable scenes, just like it did in the original game, and like in Chapter 14 in Remake Part 1. The fourth possible endpoint is, you guessed it, the death of Aerith. At the Forgotten Capital, while she prays, Sephiroth falls from above and fatally stabs her. However, things could be different here. Despite saying they don't intend to deviate much from the original story, and I do believe Aerith will die in Remake. It's possible that the context of the scene could change depending on various factors, such as whether certain theories are true, like Sephiroth being from the future, and whether or not the alternate timeline comes into play somehow. Regardless, after Aerith's death, you fight Jenova Life, then hold a funeral for Aerith, and Disc 1 of the original game ends here. To end Remake Part 2 here as well would be extremely fitting considering the fact, though it would hurt a lot for the players' hearts to do so, and it would also be a massive cliffhanger that might not feel as much of a climactic end as Part 1's. But, depending on Nomura and crew's mindset, that may be the reason why it's a perfect place to end it. Now, the fifth and last potential ending point is the most unlikely, as it's quite a ways ahead. It's past the Icicle Inn, past the snowboarding minigame, past Gaia's Cliff, and all the way into the Whirlwind Maze, which is an area that finishes off with an encounter against Jenova Death, and scenes where Cloud is manipulated once again into handing over the black materia. Afterward, you soon wake up in a room as Tifa under the custody of Shinra, and Barret reveals that Meteor has been successfully summoned, showing the giant rock slowly descending from the sky. This is the last potential ending point I have for Part 2, but it's pretty far into the game. In fact, depending on how this remake saga goes, this might even be the ending of Part 3. Once again, these are all just guesses. As I said before, with enough new content, Part 2 could probably end anywhere. Shit, it could probably end in the cargo ship to Costa del Sol, I have no idea. Before I close out this video, I do have a few small comments to make about miscellaneous stuff. The Midgar Zolom could be made into a mandatory fight if we get the segmented open world that I predicted. I also wonder if its name will be corrected to Midgar Sormer, the reference to the world serpent of Norse mythology that it was supposed to be. Also, could Sephiroth become playable in the Nibelheim flashback, or would that ruin his mystique? It would shock people a lot to have the camera first hover over Cloud in that sequence, then switch over to Sephiroth when a battle starts. Also, will we see Hojo chillin' at Costa del Sol, or would that be a little too odd now? It would seem like a huge mistake to talk to him there and just let him live. And out of all the future locations, I'm probably looking forward to Cosmo Canyon the most, as it probably has the most potential to be breathtaking. Also, at Rocket Town, will we actually fight Palmer himself, or will he whip out yet another giant Shinra robot? That's probably up in the air. And that basically does it. That concludes my predictions. The overworld, the gameplay, the content, the minigame, the endings. Assuming Remake Part 2 even goes far enough to show Aerith's death, I don't expect it to go beyond Meteor being summoned and waking up in that room as Tifa. I'd be shocked if it did, because it may as well just go all the way at that point. To reiterate once more, how long Part 2 will be and where it will end depend on how much expansion is given to towns and dungeons, and how much of a role Zack's supposed alternate timeline plays. If the answer is a lot for all of those things, then we could see the game ending shockingly close to the front end of the story. Anyways, now begins our 2 to 4 year wait for this game. Hopefully it's closer to 2. Maybe with the software and hardware upgrades for the development of next generation games, we could see it sooner rather than later. Fingers crossed. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.